Hello there, you're watching The Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with the political journalist for the Financial Times, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe, and the Mail's deputy political editor, John Stevens. So a very good evening to both of you. And you are both going to be with us until around midnight. So good to see you. Let's get to the front pages, though, first of all. And the Financial Times leads with the UK and the EU levelling sanctions against the Russian military and hundreds more of its oligarchs. The Metro focuses on the implications those sanctions will have on access to luxury items. Ukraine will never join NATO, reads the front of the Daily Telegraph. And The Guardian also looks at this story as President Zelensky acknowledges that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And The Times also leads with that story. The front of the Mirror looks at Boris Johnson's trip to Saudi Arabia to talk oil and energy supplies. And in other news, the front of The Sun profiles the people bidding to take over Chelsea FC after the departure of Roman Abramovich. And just a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages of tomorrow's papers for yourself while you watch us. So we're joined tonight by Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and John Stevens. So, Jasmine, first of all, a few of the front pages are focusing on what Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said today about NATO membership. You picked out the Telegraph first of all. So remind us what he said and what the implications of his statement could potentially be.
His comments were quite striking. He was essentially saying that he recognised the fact that Ukraine isn't going to be a part of NATO anytime soon. And if we remember before the invasion, this was one of President Putin's key demands of Western leaders. And I think it's important to see his comments in the context of the fact that he's been repeatedly urging NATO to take tougher action. He's been calling for no-fly zones, but the Western countries have sort of said, you know, these are the limits of our help. We can give you certain weapons, but we can't take further steps. And so he's acknowledging the West position and how far they're willing to go. And he's also trying to strike up and trying to continue negotiations with Russia and trying to agree some sort of ceasefire. Now, the Daily Telegraph quotes government insiders that say there's a bit of scepticism on the UK end as to whether, you know, the ceasefire can actually be actualised and how far negotiations can go. But President Zelensky is, you know, in a way trying to offer some sort of olive branch to the Russian regime and sort of outline that actually Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. It's not going to become a threat or partner with Western allies. It's just looking for peace. So I think his comments are striking in that regard.
Well, yes, John, what do you make of this? It's covered in The Guardian as well. Ukraine's NATO concession, they say, as airstrikes batter capital. I mean, obviously peace talks are continuing, which is some people say is obviously a good thing that both sides are continuing to talk. But could this potentially lay the groundwork for some kind of deal? Or is the truth that NATO membership is just one element of Russia's concerns? They're also deeply worried about the country's pull towards Europe as well.
Yeah, and I think that everyone clearly is quite hopeful that there might be a peace deal, but I think everyone's got to be realistic here, that this is not going to be the single ask that Russia's going to put on the table. You've got to think about all the other things that they're going to want as well. They're going to demand parts of Ukraine, territory of Ukraine. And I think that will be more difficult for Zelensky to get an agreement on, that they're going to lop off parts of his country. Obviously, lots of people in Ukraine wouldn't be happy about that. And you look at the scale of the Russian invasion. Clearly, what Vladimir Putin was hoping to get was a complete regime change. You know, he wants to take out Kiev. He wants the whole government to be taken over, to take over the whole country. You look at the number of troops that he's massed on the borders. And so I think that some agreement that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, which clearly isn't on the cards anyway at the moment, I just don't think it's going to be enough. And I think actually that's why the government is quite sceptical about whether this is actually going to lead to some sort of peace deal.
And Jasmine, a quick reflection on the fact that, as John was saying there, the ambition clearly by Russia was to take over the whole country. They thought they'd do it relatively quickly. I think they imagined that they would be able to move in on Kiev within the first few days. They're still not in control of that city 3 weeks on. And today we did see this visit, didn't we, by the Czech, Polish and Slovenian prime ministers into that city. I mean, quite symbolic that they were able to travel there and show their support for Volodymyr Zelensky.
I think so. And I do think President Putin really underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government. And I think in many ways, Putin also underestimated the unity of the West. I'm sure he was hoping that Western countries would be preoccupied with recovery from coronavirus, wouldn't really present such a united front. But actually, as we've seen, whether it comes to things like sanctions or the sort of verbal messages that are coming out from places like the US, the UK, and the EU, they are sort of combining with a unified voice on this. And so I think in many respects, President Putin, this whole invasion hasn't really gone to plan. But I do think it is important to remember that Russia has vast military strength and is willing to use it. And I think this may unfortunately be a long, protracted conflict. And unfortunately, that will mean more front pages showing bombed cities, and that will increase the number of people that are having to flee for their lives. So I think we might be in this for the long haul.
Well, yes, and you mentioned a unified front on sanctions there, Jasmine, and the Financial Times picks up on that element of the story, John, tomorrow, doesn't it? West turns up heat on Moscow with moves against oligarchs and the military. And this is not just the UK expanding their list of people and items that are being sanctioned, but the EU as well.
Yeah, the EU have sanctioned Roman Abramovich today, who obviously the UK sanctioned, I think it was the end of last week. And the UK today has sanctioned, I think it's 370 individuals and entities. And at the start of the sanctions process, it did seem to be going a bit slow. People were quite frustrated by how it seemed to be taking a bit of time. But they seem to have really got into gear now. And one of the changes that's made things easier is that law that was passed by Parliament that means that if an ally of the UK, someone like the EU, sanctions someone, then the UK can very quickly just mirror that, repeat that, and do exactly the same thing, that they don't have to go through in the same detail to prove the links between these individuals and Russia. So it does seem like a much quicker process. And you also look at the other ideas that they're starting to look at. One of the things that they've announced today is this ban on luxury goods, things like cars, watches, art, being able to be imported into Russia. And that's really turning the screw on kind of the influencer generation. These young people who are the children of oligarchs who like to flaunt the wealth that they've got on Instagram. It's trying to track down on that and stop them being able to get hold of these luxury goods. So it's targeting Russia in loads of different areas and loads of different ways.
And Jasmine, I've just noticed your byline on this article. I think we should give you credit. You have got a couple of others there alongside you. But a quick word from you then, given that you've written the article. So what do you think then? The UK, as John was referring to there, has been accused of being a bit slow on sanctions. Does it feel now like it's doing enough? And has the delay meant that some of these people may have been able to shift their assets?
I mean, I think it is fair to say there was a lot of criticism towards the government at the very beginning. I think their initial argument was always that it's going to be slow and steady. They're going to gradually ramp up the sanctions, in a proportionate manner. And I think they have done. And I think the passing of the legislation earlier this week has really helped the UK align its sanctions regime with the EU and the US. I think, as John was saying, I think the sanctions have been somewhat effective in trying to drive a wedge between Putin and the people. And so some of these sanctions, it's impacting the Russian economy, it's impacting day-to-day lives of Russian individuals, whether it's, whether or not they can go to IKEA or the products that are imported and exported out of the country. And so I think, we are seeing an impact. But I think the big question for me is that, the sanction haven't really acted as a deterrent. So we're seeing the West escalate sanctions, but it hasn't necessarily slowed Putin down, even if the impact on the Russian economy has been immense. And so there is that question of what the end goal of the sanctions really is, and at what point does it stop, or at what point, does it get to the fact that we've imposed so many sanctions and it's now starting to influence what's happening in the West and sort of Western economies. We know there's already concerns about the cost of living crisis. And so the end game of these sanctions is a bit unclear to me.
Well, yes, and let's just have a quick look at how the Metro covers it. They focus on the bling aspect, the luxury goods aspect. You're not blinging anymore is their headline there. But you talk about the cost of living crisis, Jasmine. If we look, John, at the front of the Mirror, they focus on the concern about the UK weaning itself off Russian oil and gas, and this proposed trip by the Prime Minister to Saudi Arabia to try to persuade them to perhaps increase production to try and help with the price of oil, but coming under criticism from the Mirror there.
Yeah, and we all know the difficulties that people are facing with the cost of living at the moment. Anyone who goes to fill up their car at the moment can see how much the prices have gone up. And so you can see why Boris Johnson's trying to find a way around this, trying to find other countries that we can possibly get oil and gas from. I think the decision to move away from taking stuff from Russia and then going to authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia is a very difficult one, especially when you've got the context of just this weekend. You had Saudi execute 81 people. I think that's why it is quite a difficult path for the government to tread, and why there's a lot of campaigners who are quite unhappy about the Prime Minister making this trip.
Yeah, let's move on. We're trying to squeeze a lot in here, Jasmine. So many different elements of this story, aren't there? We're going to turn to the front of the Times next, because they've got a photograph here on their front page of people who have left Ukraine. And this is focusing on the UK's new scheme to try to house refugees here.
Mm. And it's been particularly striking. Obviously, the scheme was only announced a couple of days ago, but we're seeing thousands of British people sort of register their interest and say that they'd be willing to take those who were fleeing from Ukraine in. And I think that's been really encouraging. I think the outward sort of public generosity doesn't detract from the fact that the Home Office has come under a lot of criticism in recent days over its handling of the refugee scheme. And, you know, there are all sorts of questions over Priti Patel's involvement and what more the government could have done, really. And I think it's quite striking that Tory MPs, both publicly and privately, have also voiced a bit of frustration. They're getting letters from constituents who are sort of saying, we're seeing what's happening on the TV screens, on the front of the newspapers, we want to help. What can we actually do? And so I think the big question for the government in the next couple of days will be, how is this scheme sort of implemented practically? And is it, you know, how are we making sure that those who are vulnerable are getting the adequate support they need, a house where they need to go, and are sort of helped to integrate into UK society and given the support to get jobs and go into schools and that sort of thing.
OK. And yes, and I think the latest figure just after 9 o'clock was 122,000, just over that, had applied or expressed interest in that scheme. So an extraordinary response. Jasmine and John, for the moment, thanks very much indeed. I'm very pleased to say, though, you will be staying on with us into the 11 o'clock hour. But for the moment, thank you. Let's take a quick look at the weather now.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, there'll be some rain tomorrow, mainly for England and Wales, but high pressure will keep things settled by the end of the week. Many places will start cloudy and dry, but there'll be outbreaks of rain for eastern Scotland, Cumbria and West Wales. There'll be a patchy frost for Ireland, Northern Ireland and northwest Scotland. Low cloud and rain will take over more of England and Wales during the morning, but the southwest looks mainly dry. Expect some brightness there. Eastern Scotland will see further patchy rain too, and elsewhere it'll be largely dry with plenty of sunshine, but there will be a few showers in the far west. Some of them will be heavy. It'll be cooler than today for most of us. Eastern Scotland, Wales and Western England will turn increasingly sunny during the afternoon. Elsewhere, though, there'll be little change, but rain over central and eastern England will become heavy in places, perhaps leaving Saharan dust deposits. The odd rumble of thunder is possible too. And looking ahead to Thursday, that's going to bring showers, I'm afraid, some heavy, but much of England and Wales will look dry and sunny.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up next on Sky News at 11, a 35-hour curfew is in force in Kiev tonight after the city's mayor warned of difficult hours to come.